아래랑도 고알에 끼워 렘비기 지일렌 줘들라 가나가려 요래스네 가상한도 지위에 제가는 용으로스네 아니 지금 세세네 지와 아니 시당들이야 세세네 지와다 쇠놈세네 지와 아니 양아와 안마바가 시와선데 시오레에서 이긴 도시에요래 다시로 지리가블라 삼로데 가르코스네 디네 시심세디 네 삼로 데 치심 계획제바다 미기외제바 안에 롱바딩이 제바 도시오레스 어디서 가상도 디고 마시거로.
And good morning. So last night we continued to look at the process by which one takes rebirth in samsara. So this section has three main outlines, and we've looked at the first two, that of afflictions and then karma. And last night we started to look at how you die and are reborn. And of the 5 subpoints, we looked at the first, conditions for death. So there we saw that there are 3 conditions for death: to die from the exhaustion of one's lifespan, to die following the exhaustion of one's merit, and thirdly, to die by failing to avoid dangers. Thereafter, we moved and started with the second of the 5 subpoints, the sub-outlines, the minds of death. And we saw as one approaches death, one can have either a mind that is virtuous, a mind that is non-virtuous, or an unspecified mind.
어두시네 가산티 슈바레 디네다당 언도 안젤레다 계체리 당도 가산 슈바티기 돈다 계체리 가르스네 안도 다시 치심세디 다데 안도 시로체기데 제디 남산 말에 그 시에기 지나미 통야다 암조 고야다 젠바르 슈헤디 갑레 치심세디 데네 갑라 섬노디 개와치르 유튜브에나 안딘마지는 곧 또 신입에 마산 개발도 균균이네 직조하지 많이 안에 다데 시비기 레세 등원도 규비 계획이 단예마 계획 편지 레기 사시비 계획 레기 방배다 시바세디 네디게네 시베 레디 계획 레디 원도 규투고레스 지나다 미게 와서 두신데다 데네기 미게 와서 섬노 코바이다 디 견지네 언제마디 시비 레디 원도 규리 미게 왜 시비 레디 원도 규고레스 대자다 계획 레기 시봉 레기 시바도 원도 규바이나 디 이게와 치마디에 덴도레 기루고레 미게 레기 시바도 원도 규바이나 안에 가소레 응안을 마기루고레 에세지 안다 디제다.
So perhaps the most important point that we looked at last night is that in the section, the minds of death, that in the period when death is nearing, but whilst one still has, it says, coarse compositional factors operating. In other words, one still is aware. One can think, one can direct one's mind, one can be aware of what one is seeing, recognize what one's seeing, and understands speech and so forth. And that this point, where death is nearing, but one is still aware, it's imperative to turn your mind to virtue, whether under one's own volition or encouraged, guided by those around you, so that virtuous karmic imprints ripen in one's mind, and one's mind is virtuous. Because this then will aid the later ripening of virtuous propelling karmic imprints, which will lead to a rebirth in the happier migrations as a human or as a god. Whereas if one has a non-virtuous karmic imprint ripening at death, then one falls to the lower realms. So here, whilst one is still cognizant, one is to guide one's mind or have others encourage you to turn your mind to virtue.
롱마딩 셈 치심 롱마딩에서 제베이나 다 개와다 미가 가야마 엠바섬로시 도시네바나 단 니기가서 되네 안마네 시비 레디 야나 게벨 시비 레 총원도 교 야나 미기베 시비 레온도 가로시 규고 그러와 이 간데스에서네 되네 안에 미기베게 가서 롱마딩이 치심제도 마시도 안에 기비 안에 순 가르몬도 규레라나 델야 니가 공부 가르쳐 와이나 소수기 개화래야 공부하게 개화 Debilia, Gawalia, some of the Gawalas, Gombashu Chawa Yobaina, and Digi, and the Gavili, and the Sipan on the Gukures, and then Migi, some of the Gombadi Shuche Yobaina, Digi, and the Migi Sibili on the Gukures, the Gombachation on it in Shungures as Mundua.
So this is the case. And so here one then is encouraged to direct one's mind to virtue so as to ensure a good rebirth and prevent a non-virtuous mind arising and one leading to one to fall to the lower realms. So what about if in this period one's mind is unspecified? So in other words, neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So again, as the translator mentioned last night, unspecified, this Tibetan term literally means not taught in scripture or not specified in scripture. So in other words, the Buddha didn't say whether a particular mind is virtuous or non-virtuous. Well, another way to translate this would be ethically neutral, because it's neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So should one be moving towards death with a mind that is unspecified, then when the karmic imprint, karmic imprint of the type that one is most habituated to will ripen and direct the mind in a virtuous or non-virtuous direction. So if one is most habituated to a particular type of virtuous imprint, then one's mind will be directed in a virtuous direction, leading to a favorable rebirth. Whereas if one is most habituated to non-virtuous ways of thinking, then that will lead to the mind being non-virtuous and leading to rebirth in the lower realms.
depende corona to the mid number of shinen and jige conjole deva yubas yene sangi jumden yu kubaru corona dile de ala soba oda kyona sangelia and gemroje and jeshos shendasha kar samtang go mare da ya konjosum de gyapsur gemrojena and diche and kyona jaju sem komya komjo seda on denegi sheba ina and ya corona kewa samdi tenurwa tenurwa deni dede and remember how that can that she to war in that can ya control sometime and the girl 직접 좀 sometime the 야고리 내가 주인의 결혼도 날에 샵된 지위에 세제 나야 최고 부위된 게 지위 컨트롤 최고 부위 샵된 지위에 결혼 방법에 겨워하고 야 또 나가 지위라 봐나 그런 뒤 삼로 코라진 엔게에 삼로 코라디 연구로 어디에 뒤서야 계신 거라 최고래.
What we've looked at here thus far in the sub-outline, The Minds of Death, is very important because it's presenting that when one is approaching death, it's imperative that one should generate a virtuous mind. And that can be done either under one's own volition or encouraged by others. So at some point we will be in this position ourselves as the person leaving this life, or we may be at the bedside of someone who is approaching death. So if it's oneself or at the bedside of someone else who is a Buddhist, then it's useful to, on one hand, reduce worldly distractions around them, distractions in the sense of their mind being turned in that direction, and it's imperative to help the person to generate a virtuous mind of the Dharma. So this is, I'm talking now specifically in the context of someone who's a Buddhist, such as ourselves or someone that you know. So there one can place a Buddha image before them with a statue or a picture, because being a Buddhist, merely seeing an image of the Buddha should lead to will lead to a recognition and a mind of faith arising. And then one can also talk to the person about refuge and about bodhicitta, and encourage them to generate their mind in that direction. Or maybe even recite prayers that they are very familiar with, and they, now still being cognizant, will follow what you are saying, maybe even can repeat, and their mind will be turned in that direction because they are still understanding. Also, you can say to them that now that your end is nearing, I will recite prayers for you, perhaps prayers they're very familiar with, and you can recite it at their bedside. And you can also say, we will do prayers or pujas for you outside of here, and we'll make offerings on your behalf and dedicate the merits so that you do not need to, so that you can be confident your next rebirth will be excellent. So in this way, you help them have a positive mind and a virtuous mind as they are guiding towards death, or your friends would be doing that for yourself. In particular here, encourage them to generate minds of refuge and minds of bodhicitta.
도신 미를 통해다 뭐 잡아 땜부 매바자 되는 뭐 마신 거자 되는 마진은 가감질이야 미다 단 나요 오보다 단 나요 직 가셔 오보디 도시나 가루고로 되는시 말은 바시 다된 마지도 나 시바시 동원도 규비 갑라다 다 내동원도 되는 디여서 치심 참모시 그래다 치심 될라 차라다데 대신 열셔야 되는 치심 라고 거기 시고라 다 되는 마지다 치심 참모셔야 돼 야시 원시의 차상가 산에 시반의 이기 넘버 시바 참모지마도 요마다 니 내가 보다 지금 참모시고 그래.
Here we're talking about the minds of death. So in English we have as a plural, which is very useful because there is a varying degrees of subtlety with regard to the minds of death. So what we have been looking at thus far, as we see in the second line, is there's the word coarse. So this is still referring to where coarse consciousnesses are manifest. So one is able to think and direct one's mind. One is able to see and recognize and generate thoughts in relation to what one is seeing. So, for example, seeing a Buddha image leads to the mind of refuge being generated. And one is still able to hear and understand. So the coarse minds are still present or still manifest, but one is nearing death, hence minds of death. But these then, in a sequence, the coarser minds dissolve or become non-manifest, and then subtler minds become manifest. And this is a process of varying of a number of stages of going from coarse consciousnesses being manifest to subtler and subtler consciousnesses. So, for example, one will at some point not be able to see or hear, and one will not, but one will still have an inner dialogue going on, and then that inner dialogue too will fade. So this is a process by which coarser consciousnesses become non-manifest, leaving subtler consciousnesses, and there are various levels to subtler consciousnesses. And in the end, when the sense consciousnesses have all become non-manifest, then only subtle mental consciousnesses will remain, and eventually the most subtle mental consciousness at the time of death, that alone will be manifest.
나요 오버가 님이 오버가 되네 류리야 초 류오버디 파가니나 오디 파다 대승을 다시 시도 가르시고서 오디 파지 땅 수텐 두고 말해 되는 시리네.
So in this death process, the sense consciousnesses, they are amongst the first to become non-manifest. But one will still be breathing, so there is still life in the body. But at some point, one makes the final inhalation, followed by the final exhalation. And at that point, death comes.
당은 지소를 지진다데 시와래래 거다 우치 파당 수태면다 우요 말어디 시와래래 거다 이내 당은 빼진나는 쇼능문에 셔반다데 시요 말해 그 나올이야 우디 요래 거 치우디 쳇사버래 치우를 파티한 수디제 매바 차사와데 나로 우요래 제산도 우신데노 그 림발 마선에 림바지 루고래 시 제산 시사요 시요 말해.
This point of death, when the final exhalation of breath is made, this will be commonly accepted as death. But in the Buddhist texts, it states explicitly that this is not the actual moment of death, because whilst the body lacks the capacity to exhale air, there is still breath within the body. So death has not yet come, but it certainly is progressing towards that final death.
예. 그래서 당한도 중에 시비 치원원에 그디 치고라선데 시 치심 참어서야지 시비를 세는 원도 치심 참어서야지 디 치심 참어데 매바 가로도 되는 시발에 참어디 막 가서도 매바 잘 되는 시발에.
So in the texts, what do they say is the point in which death actually comes? And that is when the subtle mind of death, that itself, ceases.
에사당원의 시요도 가르 딱상로치 가르용 것은 누군 마차되스 돼 우리 시래. 근데 디 되번당원의 시살다. 남 나로가 나오지 제살다.
So an observable external sign that actual death has come, so an external visible sign that the final mind of death has ceased, is when a speck of blood emits from the nose.
예. 아니 내게다 나는 먼저 도초에는 제보시라요 말에 되니 도요값 쉐이비게 되니 있다 제보시라요 말에 아데가 마시리 된마다 마스마 가산들이야 심바 망부요래 제사단 예편에 라관냥아 세다 삼로디 원모 차상 가산들 라관냥아 삼로디 바가 되는 마지 나와 쳐봐 안에 터봐 녀럽 되네 안에 지금 회사 세대 되니기 마 도신 치워 세선 지야요 되지 바심발 마소나 망부용 거래.
As I've described thus far, is the common presentation, common with Sutra and Tantra. But then Tantra goes into more detail, presenting subtler states of consciousness that are uncommon in the sense that they are not presented in Sutra. So they're really talking about subtler levels of consciousness dissolving at death. So these will be what we've once heard of, the white appearance, the red increase, and the black attainment, as well as then the mind of clear light. So now we return to the text. So we come to a second sub-outline within the minds of death. So we've looked at the minds of death. Now we come to appearances at the time of death.
치심 기회 전에 삼다지도 싫어배나 나와 가는 실리그래 치심 미개와 지식이 싫어도 겁나 나와 가는 리그래 제가 어두신에 지게 마셔야 되네 인자다 내마 때려 직대로 나와들라 내가 서다 치심 기회 전에 제바는 시바나 다 나와야 되는 중고래 세시고래 내가 개와 제바니 몬트에 나와 좋아다 달라 치외세 밀람더비 수이도와 나서 중심 대거를 치라 내주에 신도 삽충어스 대신에 치심 계획 제나세지 치심 계획 제반의 시조도 나와 가르리게 됐어도 다 드시고를 치심 미계획 제제 나와 가르리고는 디디시어 제사다 개와 제바 치심 계획 제바 개와지 치심 계획 제네 시조도 나와 가르리고는 데니스리고를 시주어다
So here, this is now we maybe 6-7 lines down from the Minds of Death on page 174. So this is talking about what appears to the mind at the time of death, and it will look at what appears to a virtuous mind at the time of death and what appears to a non-virtuous mind at the time of death. So again, I just read the first sentence, and I just need to change a little bit. Okay. So no need to read anything from the text right now. Again, I'm going to give an overview and then read from the text.
개와 제반이 시도 넘윤 지단에 가서 개와 뭐지 개와를 검시야 보여 봐체 개와야 보여 그제 안에 시위가로야 되는 개위 심지 원도 교체 시위나 안에 나와를 섭니다 나와 가르리게 전에 또 문초에 나와 줘버려 집에 나온 바지마 다 이모 예산 다와 같은 게 샤도 바로 이모 샤도 두진 조고요 바데 나와래야 되는 중고래 이제 그런 되는 중고래 안에 이제 니마 좋아하는 잘라서 디스오래 마시 버도치데 치료시데 계획에서 논의 교로 치심 계획에서 기시오라고다. 대녀만 지단하는 new 개와야 고치 되네 치료지리걸 치심 개와 주변에 개와이나 안에 되는 시리걸 나와 가르리게 해서네 멤버네 노고는 마 되는지 야 왜여서 여서들이야 봐도고요 봐. 제가 이제 되는 게 나와 왜기 나와로 시작을 해지래.
So looking at the text, for those who have cultivated virtue, so this is what we've had some discussion on, cultivated virtue. What this means is it's those who have cultivated a mind of virtue at the time of death. So this is then ties to what we've seen before, because what's translated here is what the text says. The meaning is those who have cultivated a mind of virtue at the time of death. It will also be related to them having a strong habituation to virtue in their life, and therefore being able to have cultivated easily a mind of death a virtuous mind at the time of death. So that's the meaning of this cultivated virtue. It's that having spent gained strong habituation to virtuous minds in their life, then at the time of death, they are much more easily able to actually generate a virtuous mind at the time of death. And that is the kind of practitioner referred to here, for those who have cultivated virtue. Then, what appears to them? Death is like going from thick darkness into light.
얘네 치유의 밀람답의 수이도 나서 중심에서 되게 치료치도 갑라 나 거기서 일람 나네 소설이야 나야리야 수이도 와 빼네 답변에 제 사실로 장마로 다직 Jike Bangla Yabu, Nima Shar to Yovata, Deniki Medoy, Deniki Nasopa, Deni Suna Sopa, and Deniki Shagri is a Tungun, Denicoronia, Milam Nashin is Tungores, that's Samlona, Denish Tungo, Dingo, Nango, Samnalia. Samnalia do see who the Nilam Nashua. Nilam Nashin, some go on my day, Coron Nilam, some to go on my day, now Coronia, Samlona, Denish Nango, some like Denish do, say, and the Corona might Mundan, but Garsan out, I think, you wish you didn't buy 2 years and be somewhere, some knowledge in this Yungor. Corongi, you but the Corongi, you ever how could you name and how Yamar in their Corona, some knowledge now, Denish, Nilam Tonga, Nashin, Denish Yungor.
So continuing, so read now 2 sentences. For those who have cultivated virtue, so they are now dying with a mind of virtue. So this is now really at the end of the life, whereas before it was as one was approaching the end of life. Death is like going from thick darkness into light. At the time of death, various pleasant, dreamlike forms appear to them. So here they will have various appearances. There will be appearances to their mind which they find pleasant, and like having a pleasant dream. So in terms of they would see themselves in a beautiful natural environment, for example. The sun is shining, flowers are blooming. So the kind of beautiful environment that people like, and in this case, this person will be drawn towards. So when it says dream-like, there isn't the recognition from the dying person, oh, this is like a dream, but it is similar to how in one's regular life one dreams of a pleasant environment. So similar to that, this is what appears to them at the time of death, and they are drawn to it, attracted by it.
And there were chillas, Lulu, Nasa, Lulu, Chago, there were chillas. Then and then Niger can shindo Sapchung was a best Subul and Nasa that the nigger pay drop what the nigger Nasa drop what toa drop on your hair, you go my head.
The final sentence for those who are dying with a virtuous mind at the time of death, they die happily. So this refers to mental happiness. They die happily, and even the end-of-life agony is of very minor severity. So this term will come up many times, end-of-life agony. This refers to physical suffering. The word before, die happily, this refers to mental happiness. So the one is mental, the other is physical. So their physical suffering at the time of death is minor, and they are dying with a happy mind.
That is what this now share now so get nature that say there she said go Ombo Magania and Yungi said, the Carson Supole Nana said, Asa Sakia, and another Kashushim Young way to do the Niki Jenga Jan, that's why you want to go. She said, the Niki. That the nigga now I hear to give me she wrote it won't be my god, and the nigga now I share so she gets so toya so but the similar I chorus so sorry so into what I toya or that the nation now I share you go that I said the young is the won't be my god, and the passion goes.
So where we are in the sequence of death is we are not at the subtle mind of death yet. So I imagine that here the person, their sense consciousnesses are not yet completely non-manifest. Hence, they are able to experience physical sensation. We have here the end-of-life agony. So they are able to experience physical suffering sensations. And they are still able to make some sense or have a reaction to what is appearing to their mind. So they are in this process of progressing towards death, but we are not at the final subtle mind of death.
되게 나요. 근데 온보바가 녀래요. 온보가 차반에 비시고 그래. 그 빈진비시 디참디 디베디바 용어요 말이요. 그 온보바가 녀래요. 가서 온보바가 차디 되게 나와디 비시고 유유래. 근데 오기 되게 니주 잡침부 대화시 니주 잡침부세데 류기 동아다 나자 셈 슈침보르죠. 잡침보르 매바. 되네 매바세. 되네 셈래야 양강자시나 되네 매바로 좀 좋아. 어데 니주기 신도 잡치셔야지. 근데 류기 나자 되네 슈침보 매되게 그래요 하다. 셈래야 시나다 강자야 매되게 하지.
This process of going from coarser minds being manifest down to when only the subtle mind of death is manifest. As I mentioned earlier, there are many stages of dissolution of coarser into subtler minds. So here we are talking about going from the coarser mind, such as we have manifest in our normal state, down to the subtle mind of death. So this process is beginning, but there isn't here on what we're looking at. It's not necessarily a hard boundary between when one can experience or interpret or experience, have a response to physical suffering and mental appearances to one's mind. So it's quite possible when one's sense consciousnesses are becoming non-manifest, that one may still experience physical suffering, what is this term here, end-of-life agony, or experience mental appearances. So it's not a hard boundary of you experience such things up to here, but not from there. So it may well be that when the sense consciousnesses even become non-manifest, that there is still some reaction. So I'm not sure I'm saying it so clearly here as the translator. So it's not that the sense consciousnesses in one moment are entirely manifest and then in the next entirely non-manifest. They are becoming non-manifest. So as the sense consciousnesses weaken, there will still be appearance of suffering and happiness, but that will dissipate as the sense consciousness progressively dissipates.
This is somebody do share. That in a chisem migawar chair, and that one do being like migawar mobora chair, and then she did a chisem de migiwe some large quarter, she's on Vina, then now I can assume Korea said she had Delia, this order. Migawa Chebane, now one in Montreal to draw Adam, Jala, Chivits in the Milam Davi, so Miduba, not so Banashi, Dunga you saw a trouble Chula, near you into Sapchos.
Now, for those who die with a non-virtuous mind at the time of death, for those who have cultivated non-virtue, so again, the meaning is the same as we saw above, for those who have cultivated virtue. It refers to specifically those who are dying with a non-virtuous mind at the time of death. And this would either be because their mind is non-virtuous, or it's because the mind is habituated to non-virtue from one's life, non-virtuous afflictions really, and therefore the mind habitually is non-virtuous at the time of death. So either someone has generated minds of non-virtue, or due to habituation they have arisen. For those who have cultivated non-virtue, it is like going from light into thick darkness. At the time of death, various dream-like, repulsive forms appear to them. Intense feelings of suffering arise, not pain, suffering arise, and the end-of-life agony is also severe.
Cotrosetele, Pichigul, way meeting, no, the way meeting, Janjarochi, Droyado, the name said to Banawarochi, Sharata, the name, the Negi got the Milam delay, Tommy Cableachi, social Milam Nashin, social Suchad, Su Miduba, Yabumeba, and Miduba, not so bad to Yungore, not so bad to Shungore. The name of that simply a Dumandi, I can't simply saw Dumai saw, shoot trouble Jungada. And the judge, nature, she does subject it, and really, and that's that in a subchamboric, so Yala so what the subchamboric to do what is such in zero.
So this is quite clear, especially as it is the opposite for a person dying with a virtuous mind at the time of death. So reading through it again, for those who have cultivated non-virtue, it is like going from light into thick darkness. So it's as if they are in a state completely devoid of any light. And then in that state, then it continues at the time of death, various dreamlike repulsive forms appear to them. So again, we see this is the opposite from those who die of the mind or virtue. And then so too the way they relate to being in what appears to be thick darkness with repulsive forms or frightening forms appearing to them. The response is intense feelings of suffering arise. So suffering is better because this refers to mental suffering. The mental feelings of suffering arise. And then in terms of the body, physical feelings, and the end-of-life agony is also severe. So again, we see it's completely the opposite end-of-life experience, depending on the mind that one dies with.
문초도 좋아. 치세 미개비 제바이나 시용도 갑라 나와데 가서 문초 문바나를 봐. 너고나마 주고 요바디 나와 요바디 차상 찍바래제. 다 가르쳐버 연구를 했나 수미도 바나들 수미도 바나나 될야 나서 연구시리. 디버 슈망아 제베는 미도바 나야들 슈체지다. 디버도 제베는 디버 시라 슈충아이나 아니 미도바 나야들 슈충아로 보자. 되네게 류일에 되네게 초와 동화데 내주 탑체충들이야. 내주 네 여반에 되는 탑체충도 개발 유기를 쓰면 돼. 그런 게 시위 레벨링이야. 근데 샘제 야야 쇠쇠리 갑래야 백강아슈 당쇠야라서 강고락바제 안데 지지진도就是내주 시위 레벨링래 디버치들 걸 샘제리야 소저지데 되네게 백강아슈데 쇠야라서 받아 되네게 망부 되네게 제베네 디 시디 갑래네 코로나야 나와디게 근데 수미도바 나야 배시나 소바 나야 슈체요야 안에 디속이 샘진데서 나를 샘진데서 코로나야 강这个吧 안에 근데 자로 소자가 따라 소자가 용어버려 되네 나와셔고 되네 나와셔도 배시나 암다시 용어래 되네 안에 지식이 류래네 배 나자다 알아서 얘기하다 되네 용어 다디 코로나기 디버체네 안에 야지 디비sem기 치위sem 안에 미개용 제바 이나양 세델에 미거로 제바이나 되네기 동화 샬야 지게 디바 슈크첨보 사메바이나 셈저 소저제야다 되네기 시면 디지기라네 디나시야 또 탑중화 이게 다디 계속 개발 된대 이게
So all those who die with a non-virtuous mind or have a non-virtuous mind manifest at the time of death, they all go from light into thick darkness. There is, though, variety with the next sentence. At the time of death, various dreamlike appearances, various dreamlike repulsive forms appearing to them. So here there will be variety depending on the severity of the non-virtuous mind. So someone who has accumulated extensive non-virtue and therefore dies with a non-virtuous mind, or someone who dies with a non-virtuous mind but hasn't accumulated extensive non-virtue, they will have very different appearances at this time of death. So the repulsive forms that appear to them, there will be variety. So for example, someone who has killed a lot in their life, then with dying, they are likely to die with have a non-virtuous mind manifest at the time of death. And then the kind of forms that will appear to them will likely be those that are threatening them. They may perceive themselves as being attacked or witness around them violence. And from this feeling that their life is in danger, they are being attacked. Maybe animals are eating them or beings are beating them. From this, intense fear will arise, and also physical suffering. And this may be observed that this dying person, they clench their fists, they make sounds of expressing their fear, and so forth. So for others who, though, are also dying with a non-virtuous mind manifest, but that non-virtue is not as powerful, what appears to them, and therefore their response to it, will be not as severe. So here there really is some variety.
나서 나야 되네 야도 나야 나서 개와 같이 대비를 개와 같이 숙체요 공시 체와다 되네게 마 예배는 야시리컬 수 나와 나서 돼 나야 되래 수야 나야다 내제되게 배 잡충주네 매바 용을 가시 내제 강아 균이 매바 시로 용으로 가시 되어서 강아 여러 용으로 제가 되네게 소수기 기위 제베깔의 공시다 개와 숙치증을 통해 시위가블이야 아니 기회스 미치베이나야 가시는 내다서 돼서 수용하다 시호라고 깔래하고 매베네 내다서 돼서 수용하다 수보래 내다서 하다 되네 용거로 하다 되네 수나야 돼 이도 나야 지나 이도 나와이네 지시오지 이도 와 매바 용으로 가시는 아직 뱀마시 이도 와 나야 용으로
Continuing with the sentence, so at the time of death, various dreamlike repulsive forms appear to them. So I've spoken now about this word various and what it means. And therefore the result of that is that the intense feelings of suffering, so mental suffering, and the end of life, agony, so physical suffering is also severe. So because there is a variety in terms of the strength of the non-virtuous mind at the time of death, there is variety in terms of what appears to the dying person, and therefore there is variety in terms of the intensity of the feelings of mental suffering and the feelings of physical suffering, end-of-life agony. So someone dying with a non-virtuous mind can feel severe or intense, or less intense, less severe physical and mental suffering, depending on the strength of the non-virtuous mind at the time of death. This is also the case for those who die with a virtuous mind. So if we go up here, a couple of lines. So those who die with, for those who have cultivated virtue, they die happily, so the happy mind, pleasant mental feelings, and even the end-of-life agony is also of very minor severity. So someone dying with a virtuous mind manifest, of course there will be variety in terms of the strength of that virtuous mind, and therefore there will be a variety in terms of the resulting feelings of mental happiness, as well as the variety in terms of the end-of-life agony, in terms of being severe, or how minor that is. So those who die with strong virtuous minds, they may well not experience any end-of-life agony at all. For others who die with a less strong virtuous mind, but nevertheless a virtuous mind, they may experience a minor severity or very minor severity in terms of the physical suffering. And likewise, in terms of the mental happiness, there will be a gradient there, depending on the quality or the strength of the virtuous mind with which they die.
얘기도와 니마 되네 용거리 semjen 망보 쇠 네 자나 semjen 망보 직 쇠네 대 쇠는 이게 되네 가시 시르르 갑래 시로치도 내 녀에도 우체마다 대수게 가서 다 등할래야 버주 망보가 누가 리도 로봇치로치스 로봇치가 쇼스 되네 가 자망보 소자가 리도 어디 켜서 가 로봇치입니다 로봇이다선 얘기가 현나게 되네 용도와 되네 뭐소 대디스 망보 가요 말에 나와라 코로나 되네 샤거와 어디 미가지 가 지체 진가 지수와 리도 가 쇠가 리도 로봇치가 쇼스 얘기도 되네 용거래 이 디치선 나와 되네 샤와자 네 되네 그 코로나 지 디소다 기시에요 기게로 암초다 미차가 하여로 와다가 지 제제 요디가지 디네 갑르네 나와 되네 용거다 네 주다고 메테세데 수나 소반 미도바 나 소반 나 소와 잡고 세데데 셴나 소나 소와 잡고 게데 도시네 되네 또 내주 동가 잡지 문요아래 세데 되네게 용거 되네 먼저 베이디와 어다 되네 게 잡제 되네 게 시간 되네 되네 제소해야 돼 시에 고야요래 제가 대수 삼단데 지고때 나와 되네 용거가 다시 줘라.
What one can tell from this section we're looking at, for those who have cultivated virtue up to this point here, the sense and end of life agony is also severe. That sense consciousnesses are still manifest because they can feel the physical sense consciousness, the contact, the body, that is clearly still manifest. Also, they are able to make sound, so the body is still functioning. So, what I've certainly heard accounts from the area that I'm from, the region that I'm from, that when people who die, who have, for example, who have killed a lot in their life, killed birds and so forth, that when they are in this state, they're approaching death, their sense consciousnesses are waning but still manifest. They have these fearful appearances and they feel they are being attacked by birds, for example. And they call out to those around them for help because they feel that they really are being attacked by birds, just as if one was having a nightmare, so dreamlike. They feel like they are being attacked and they call out for help. So I've heard accounts of this. And this also then goes to show that here we are not talking about the subtle mind of death, because the sense consciousnesses are not completely non-manifest. They are still to a degree manifest.
다 삼로 롱바디 삼로 거는 시바 나서 롱바디에 셈다 된바니 말 셰바 시베디도 이미 중어 진짜 롱바디에 삼로 시코바이나 다 삼로 롱바디에 삼로게 진 시스템 되는 진 시바이나 디니에 셰게다 네 강한이도 용거 말해야지 진짜 롱바디에 셈다 된바라네 말 셰바디도 이미 중어 세지로 진짜 알려 어레레레 디라도 내주기 하다 냐와로 소바 기내신 많이 마도베 기내 담제를 요새 대신 내주기 동화세야디 하다 냐와 발라 요 말에스 디멘비게다 둔로다 이다다 미 샤사를 요래세 숨도
In the final sentence in this paragraph, in all birthplaces except for gods and hell beings, there is end of life agony. So this physical suffering is experienced by those who are humans, and then in the lower realms of animals and spirits.
지산에 주게 동화 세디 밀야 둔돌이야 동화 망보 예배 나네 네주 세디 네주 세디 가르소르스네 시에게 소르야 닝아 시 소르게 닝아 네 세디 계체와로지 계체와 배나 주기 닝게 자당 되네게 안지기 도시네 제바이나 디제바이나 디소 쉐주로 제가 네주 세디 되네게 계체와로 소바 되네 소 가야기 내가 수비기 내가 체에 되니게 강아 체소만은 내내 도시네 강아지 내주기 동화셔야지 되니지 제시라 지리도 이제 다녀 봐다 하디kel이야 수부기 되니게 자란 인다 로알라 소바다 되니 연애면다 되기로 와 되니 지면에다 제단다 할메세리 되니 샤초로 되니 할메세리 하다녀 봐려 말세리 근데 샘제 수요도 개바제 돈이 개바제 제제네 우 수요요로와 아니 개담지 수요요로와 안데 내게 하네 안지게 내내 주의도 가서 내게 응고로 받아 내 솔로 가야게 냥아야 지대제 제사다 라다녀 발라 라디길이야 만줄레 닝당 안주 미수 분하시에 대기로 와다 나로래 자다 차다 닝다 자디 내게 예담에 대기로 와당
It says here, in all birthplaces except for gods and hell beings, there is end-of-life agony. So to understand why not for gods and hell beings, then let's talk a little bit about this term end-of-life agony. So this term comprises of, this term has two syllables. So if we look at them separately, so it's nature. The first is ne. It means something of great importance, or in philosophy it could be a difficult point that needs detailed analysis. But here we could say, or a critical point, a vital point. So that's the first term. And the second is to cut. So just as an aside, the practice that's not translated in English is called che. Che practice is this word, cutting, to cut. So we have a vital point at the first as syllable, and the second syllable is to cut. So that is what then is translated here as end-of-life agony. So if we think of what is a vital point in terms of the body, it may be, for example, the I forget the name, maybe it's the aorta, these veins around the heart that lead from the heart, I think, and if they are cut, then life will end. So this would be a vital point in the body, one of these primary veins or arteries, that if they are cut, then life will end. So this kind of thing, humans have, animals have, spirits have, but perhaps gods and hell beings do not. And therefore, because the composition of their bodies is quite different, then they are excluded. So for example, we could also understand it not just in terms of the veins and arteries, the vital veins and arteries, but also strangulation would be another illustration. So certainly in terms of spirits, then they can be strangled. So in these ways, we can see that beings in certain realms, their bodies have these vital points that if cut, death will come. Therefore, a great fear follows. Whereas if a being has a body without such vital points, then this end-of-life agony, this fear of a vital point being cut, will not arise. So this is perhaps why gods and hell beings, for them, there is no end-of-life agony.
That is on the Chidang Nishigorwa. That she do go like Chasa Dinish, you have be don't your marisne, that Diniki, Yoagi, Yon, Meva Yonsi Rapine, and to hear the intimacy, Kambanal Village, Nietzsche, and the Mengan and Shiving ever your marwa. Bene sem generation and me simply, Bene at us, Sigurwa, Suyo Dine, and yet you do much in Bolivor, that's what Joyaki, get them, Suya, Dubnesia, Milliane, go Dumnesia. Denegi Ajige Suya the Ungurwa, Denegi Naso Ungurwa. And the Jigmengan road, the Denege Nazasuro is a capture of Shavana, and then you do not drop on your scale, or a capture Yarwad, the Hang never scale Marwad, that is so Chidan and Yaman, the Chidangi Shigoro, and the hand in Jimiji, Tesun, Nesu do not drop on Yungue, that Yunguri Marisene, capture Shamban Meva Sushavana, and so on Meva Sushavana, Denegi Nasitiki. 죽시보야디 용어야 말와 이내다 나와 나서 요새 샘기 나와디기 바시 용그리다 가지 가토야 메르와
So what's being presented here, we should understand it to be a general presentation, not necessarily entirely or completely pervasive in all circumstances. Because if one is able to die quietly at home, in other words, in a nice environment with control and influence over this death process, then one will have an experience like this. Whereas if one dies, say, through violence, then maybe not all of these processes will be followed. And where this is maybe clearer is if one dies in hospital with, what are these things called? Under strong medication, so that one's mind is very clouded, so maybe strong pain medication, then these all these experiences may not well come. However, my presumption is that no matter how one dies, whilst one may not experience end-of-life agony, either through sudden death through violence, sudden and complete death through violence, or because one is so heavily medicated, appearances to the mind, this will still come. So that description, I'd imagine, is more likely to be experienced, whereas the end-of-life agony, this may be prevented due to the way one dies.
Yeah. That lumba dinge simna tembalani ngar shebiki didu yimi jungosa. That lumba dinge sim chisim chebaina, chisim yukune la shibaina, that denegi ngarkida ngar shebi didu yimi jungosa, da di hirunirida. Lula nechu dunga chakbo yunga deke dese yung mare sachi. Da denegi nawa be jige karsori bene su mituba chiu toya deke dene yung mare sachi insarida.
And continue. So we've looked here in this in these lines to
didu ni sirida and su be yidu wa toya tone and assembly dela la ya rusta and that the devi chisimje shebana and sem dela la yungure sa chirwa and didu ni sirida dewa de denegi dela la shukchimbo de yung mare and denegi and dunga ni ju chimbo sapchimbo de yung mare sa niga didu ni ngar shebe sirla da 개회심 지나 된데 용거래 미기회심 지나 된데 용거래 세시 이바디 디니버 니가 용말에 세신서다.
The minds of death, there are the three, virtuous, non-virtuous, and unspecified. So we looked at that last night. And now we've looked at what appears to those minds. And we've looked at two of the three, virtuous and non-virtuous. So now we come to the third, that of the unspecified mind. And again, unspecified literally means not specified or taught in the sutras, or to translate it differently, ethically neutral, because it's neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So at the very last line on page 174, neither happiness nor suffering, as explained above, arises in those who have an unspecified mind. So for those who are now approaching death, and their mind is ethically neutral and specified, then they are not going to experience strong mental happiness or suffering, nor strong physical agony, end-of-life agony. So this is how a person who dies or is approaching death with an unspecified mind will experience their end of life.
되네. 나대시 언제 치심 치외체 세대 미기외스 나기외스 오늘 유그리에서지 다디가는 유그리에서지래다 치외체 게 미기 셈니 강 공바 채와디 오늘 유르기 셈신 제소 미주라 니가로 공바 냠나니 당보를 강한 템바디 아니 오늘 유라 제소 신 제소 미주고 오세
Now we come to another sub-outline. So we're at the very top of page 175. At the time of death, whichever mind is most familiar becomes manifest, virtuous or non-virtuous, and other minds do not subsequently operate. If they are equally familiar, that which is recalled first will become manifest, and others do not subsequently operate.
당한테 대지 치심 개왕도 교수 미가왕도 교수 디간스 교구를 해야지 직접을 했다면 디스거다 치심 개위지에다 미개위지에 이니 강공바데 원도 교수 다방한 저기 개화제 개화디 공부 숙체와 여바이나 아니 치심 개화디 원도 교수 그래 해서 원도 교구래 당한 주선 비린리아 미kom시데 미가와 제와도 kom시 숙체를 제와이나 공부 숙체와 여바나 내 치심 미개위에서 원도 교구를 해서 디스모다다 디제도와도 공부 체와 강 공부 체와디 개화라 강 공부 체와이나 개위에서 원도 교구를 현심전다디 용 말해서 근데 강 미가와 공부 체와이나 아니 미개위에서 원도 교구를 해서 강 공부 체와도 원도 교구기 심신 지수 미줄라스 대변에 하는 주디로와 미지게다 결혼되는 지고에서 오늘 봐 꿈을 제시에 계획서 오늘 교주야 연구로와 아니 미국 오늘 교주야지 연구로와 되네 멤버지 안다 되네 멤버는 그 계획 그 개와 사여를 미국와 사여를 계획서 오늘 간에서 오늘 교를 미국에서 간에 오늘 교를 해서 저러다 되네 세번다 그 아니 그런 세대야 개와로 공부가 채워 유배는 계획서 오늘 교를 해서 미국에 라케와체 공부체와에는 미국에서 오늘 교를 해서 다디 미션 유구뭐 제가 매바제 그런 게 고로도 신 오늘 교회에 간에서 교를 해서는 네 공부체 중원 교를 해서
If we look at the start of this point, the minds of death, we see there in the third line, depending either on one's own action or being made to recall them by others. So this is what we've looked at thus far. If, as one is approaching death, one either intentionally, under one's own volition, generates a virtuous or non-virtuous mind, or encouraged by those around you, or influenced by those around you, one generates a virtuous or non-virtuous mind, then that is the mind that one will approach the final period of one's life, or at the end of one's life. If that does not happen, we now come to what we're looking at here. Then, at the time of death, so reading again at the top of 175, at the time of death, whichever mind is most familiar becomes manifest, virtuous or non-virtuous, and other minds do not subsequently operate. So if one, either under one's own volition or influenced by others, does not generate a particular mind, then one's strongest habitual tendency will lead to a mind of that type arising.
먼저 제텔리아 소소한 기회 자와 강도 망보 직강 강도 제베네 개와로 공부 숙지마다 뜻이 오다 다가 시로서 선배 삼지 코르도 오다 건조라 잡소줘야 돼 개와 삼라데 코르도로 와다 하는 미네 개와 숙지마 제베네 자다 되네 매바자 미가와 숙지 보지네 근데 지게 심지어 소주야라 소바데 되니게 총지야라서 시로 오다디가지 되니게 심지어 망보지 되는 디어데서 총야라 되는 디어서 되네 미가 심지어 용식으로 와다 도선 삼다베네 디용식으로 와다 지사 공부하지 숙지에나 디용그래서 되니게 디세야디 디르와다
Someone who's led an intentionally virtuous life, cultivating minds of virtue and so forth, should they recognize death is approaching, then they will, having been trained well, will know I need to generate a virtuous mind, and having led a virtuous life will be able to do so easily because of their strong habituation. They're not trying to do something that they have very little familiarity with. But should they not recognize that death is approaching, but yet it is, then they are not intentionally trying to generate a virtuous mind. So they are not in a hopeless situation, or a helpless situation rather, but they will be aided by their lifetime of gathering virtue, of generating virtuous minds. And therefore, they will naturally or habitually a virtuous mind will arise at the time of death. And this is then the same for those who are not habituated to virtue, but non-virtue. If death befalls them, they do not recognize death is coming, their mind will just follow its natural way of thinking, and therefore their dominant affliction they are habituated to, minds of that class will arise.
ene gomba nyamba ina se da de bene da chanyom ro ji ke wa tu ya da diwa sa ya ro chanyom ro chi be ne da nyam gomba gomshi ro ji ke wa lo gomba da mi ge wa lo gomba nyamba ro shi na ga chi ge la na da dang bo gang chen ba de mo du gyu la dang bo da nyamba yu na dang bo sam na ya ne ge we sam lo ko so na di re mi ge sam lo ko na di ki gang chen so na di dang bo kar chen gi na di le ge se de dang bo kar chen ba na di 다 그다고 계획 삼는 쳔바나 디케 삼원도 교하래 다뭐 미교의 삼중원도 교소 쳔바나 미교의 삼중 원도 교하래 지심디 지거래서 제자들 대시 시다 딩예를 셰디 미션도 꾸모 맞제바제 소소한데 계획선에 미국에서 숙성원도 규그래랍나 가사 코로나 체델이야 개발로 공부 숙체와 예반나 계획선에 오늘 규그래 미국에서 뭐 숙체와 주나 미국에서 오늘 규그래 담보디 규그래선 도시셔라다 다나 다디 꾸마치게 매비기 싫다 다디나 신다도 꾸마치게 매바지 안다고 안 가사디 코로 개와다 미국에 찬용바시나 같이 그래 순위를 규그래서나 디 순위를 규래 땐데 매바요 말했어 당보 삼로 가로 cross나 딩 원도 유로 그래서 인지미지 계획에서 문을 교회에 내봐요 말했어 안에 예래 미국에서 문을 교회에 내봐요 말해 거기 당보 수전 소나 딩예를 교 그래서 제자다디 개발로 공부하는 시로지도 오다 시로지도 가시서를 삼자는 건조를 캡수 들어와는 개발 삼고라도 그런 것을 삼당 그러와디 그런 개발로 공부 채워 요바인사 이 개회 삼도 지용으로 받아 대란신기 딜레용으로 받아 미국만 지금 기시와 말다 디 자자디 제자다 되네기 찬양 바인다 가지 란신의 순위를 기회선 코로나 삼마 가르코선 그런 직진의 개와 삼단이를 콜시기래 지대 미국의 삼동 용원도 콜시기래 가ring 원도 콜소만의 딩이 치심지기래.
So these two sentences are in this sub outline of which mind manifests at the time of death. So we looked at the previous page at the start of the minds of death about intentionally or under the encouragement of others generating a virtuous mind. Or now we saw if that's not done, then what's one's strongest habituation will lead to a virtuous or non-virtuous mind arising. Now a third permutation in the next sentence, if they are equally familiar. So in other words, if one is equally habituated to virtuous ways of thinking and non-virtuous ways of thinking, that which is recalled first will become manifest and others do not subsequently operate. So if one's habituation to virtuous minds and non-virtuous ways of thinking are equal, then neither will dominate and will naturally arise. So what happens is that, how does it say it here? That which is recalled first will become manifest. So how that which is recalled first. So in this situation, it differs from what we had on the beginning of this point. So if we look at the minds of death, the third sentence down, depending on either one's own actions. So there one is intentionally generating a virtuous mind. Here, one is not intentionally doing anything, so one is under the control of one's habituation. But if one's habituations are equal, then it's just what naturally arises. So, do you understand this? If they are equally familiar, that which is recalled first, which means that which naturally arises first. In that way, it is recalled. So it's not intentionally recalled, but it naturally arises.
진이기 that에서 개와 슈치 뭐 제바이나 공부 슈치와이나 아니 인지미지 개회sem를 치심 개회sem 오늘 규비게 내가 차고 레베스 치시 개와로 공부 슈치부 여바이나 개회sem 오늘 규레스 대지랍서와 미기에서는 주 공부 슈치부인데 미기에서 오늘 규레라서와 인지민지 규비 차바 여르베 차고 레베스 개회sem 개와로 공부 슈치부인데 시두깔에 인지민지 개회sem 오늘 규비게 내가 레베스 아니 미개와로 공부 슈침보 여바이나 아니 미개에서 뭐 느껴 내가 레베스 기치베나 내가 내가 말해 다디디셔디 지당니 시고레스 다 개와로 공부 슈침보 여바이나야 다 되니기 지에 견섬 레어도 되니기 현다기 코로콘라주 미개에서 뭐 느껴 용으로 하다 이기 현다기 견제제 미개에서 뭐 느껴 용으로 네 지나도 공부할 개발을 공부 슈치무 요때 이내 치심 미고 오늘 교 용어식이 돼서 일단 대지 가서 미션다기 현기 견제제 콘라주야라서 작화기 줘야 용으로와 되는 게 전에 용어식 말이었어. 아직 미고와로 미고 슈치무 공부 줘봐는 치유 값을 아직 현다기 콘라를 꾸마치지 내 콘라 가보니고 콘라가 배sem다 니고 제수게 섬다는 콘라야 두신 꾸마치지 개회 섬로 디네시 땅고래서 셰바이나 디네 섬로 코르시바 용구르와 개회서 문도 용어시기래서 다딩이 디 섬고르다 제자데 다디셰 담보셰아디 지당네시아셰 다 개회 섬로 공부 슈치보 여바나 개회서 문도 교그래 미고 공부 슈치보는 미회서 문도 교그래서 지당이다 꾸마치게 멤버디 지당이 도시에 다냥 찐지 퇴바이나 인지민지 개화로 공부 첨부여나 기회서 문도 교그 캬그리베선 캬여만 미회서 문도 교 용그래서 미고와로 공부 슈치 보이나 찐지 퇴도 찐 약고지 퇴변은 걸어야 되는 기회서 문도 교 용시기 돼서다 다디 나랑 게 삼주 용시기 돼 비즈나다 디디데스 세고 시면도 됐던데 용그래서
Yeah, it's good to be aware, it's good for me now to point out the sequence of this presentation, which is first it was presented about in the context of intentionally generating a virtuous mind, or under the influence of someone else having generating a virtuous mind, or of course non-virtuous. So that was first. If neither of those are present at this time of death, then one's habituation to virtue or non-virtue, that will lead to the mind arriving, which mind arises at the time of death. And now, as we've just seen, if those habituations are equal, then it's what will be naturally arises first. That mind will determine whether one dies with a virtuous or non-virtuous mind. So what I want to point that out so that's clear. And then also to say, from my point of view, this is, as before, a general presentation. It's not that things are should be taken as being overly concrete. For example, we would imagine that someone who's lived a virtuous ethical life, developed many virtuous minds and strong habituation, is naturally a virtuous person, that we'd imagine at the time of death, they would intentionally turn their mind to virtue, or at the time of death, they weren't aware that it was the time of death, maybe it came about suddenly, then their habituation to virtue should dictate that they die with a virtuous mind. So this is likely, but it is not definite, because at the time of death, they may be under the influence of others around them. There may be others that they either are very attached to, and therefore an afflictive mind arises, or they are angry about something at the time of death. And then, so despite having accumulated extensive virtue, having a strong habituation to virtue, at the end of their life, they at this ending period of their life, their mind is turned in an afflicted direction, and they end up dying with a non-virtuous mind. Entirely possible. The converse is also true, but perhaps not so likely. But certainly it is a possibility that someone has led a life with a strong habituation to non-virtue, that Either, of course, they can intentionally generate a virtuous mind at death, or if they do not do that, but a non-virtuous habituation does not arise, perhaps they can be guided still. So my sequence is a bit wrong. So I'll say this part again. So someone who's accumulated a lot of non-virtue in their life, it is possible that at the time of death, they are encouraged to develop a virtuous mind and guided to develop a virtuous mind, and they die with that. It's possible, it's difficult, but it is possible. So therefore, one should take this presentation as being a general presentation, not something that it's definite will be like this, it won't be like that. In other words, it's not necessarily pervasive.
Rangi Sambana, Shengi Tendo Jupas, that was a Shengi Tendo Juba, Shengi, Kolia, give you some ten Juba, Shengi, and then Migi some ten Juba. Then just not the Shengi ten Juba, Yovanza, the Shengi to call Migawa, ten Jua Yungurua, then it did that. You had this, how could what in it?
So this really emphasizes the importance that when death comes, one is guided to a virtuous mind. Ideally, one will generate it oneself, but one will still be surrounded by conditions that will aid the generation of a virtuous mind and make it less likely that an affliction, a non-virtuous mind, may arise. And this is what we started out looking at, depending on one's own actions or being made to recall them by others. So ideally, one should be in this position, and for this position to be most effective, a lifetime of strengthening habituation to virtuous ways of thinking will make it much easier that in this time of the end of one's life, one will be able to generate a virtuous way of thinking, a virtuous mind of death.
And chisim sem chamor gyuwani nge semni dojo Lama de isim to Euros. Cesada de Jing of the Chisim Givi Chebanada, Migivi Chebanada, Rapa, Chisim de Cabla, Gawa on the Cubana, Miga on the Cubana, the Carina, Cabacayama, in the Chisim Tramo, the lady, the Shioma, the Chisim Tramo, the Tramo, the lady Cabla, and the Gawa de Yodo, Migoado, and Sem Telia, Luma de Matayoma, or Luma de Sem Tramo Curie says, that's in my shares in my own Bochanga. Migi Omba Nayo Ombo, the Nelu Omba Chazan, guarded a ye Shivama, Tamo Tartarma, Tamo de Leodu, and a day and a gasore, Gawachaza de Gawati, Undukasare, and the Miwa Karina Gaza, that is some nodelia, Lumade Simchima to Yoma, said that she's in Tamo de Lumade in Kuri, said that is more, she's in Tamo Gilbert City, game begin, ni dodging, Lumade seems to Euros.
Now, so we're in this sub-outline, the minds of death. So we've been talking about approaching death. Coarser consciousnesses are still manifest. So one sense consciousness and sense consciousnesses and various coarser mental consciousnesses are still manifest. When those then cease, the sense consciousnesses cease entirely, the coarser mental consciousnesses cease entirely, then one comes down to the subtler levels of mental consciousness alone. So now reading on from the text. At the time when the mind becomes subtle, so that in other words, those coarser sense and mental consciousnesses are all now non-manifest. Virtuous and non-virtuous minds come to a stop or cease and become unspecified minds.
나도 신앙은 대시 셰바나신 치구 디체 나오 마셰바 누신에 네 지정은 지당 지소나래 치구 체도다 시소하다 거래 이내 당은 저기 쇼니 셰바신나 그 치구 디체바리만 파우파당 소 체바리마도 치구 체바리마 나오라 낭 우체야 말 지자 대자 나오로야 넘버 셰바 네디르 시요 말이스 지금 셰바리 지자 누신에 지디 아니 되게 마시바 님의 찍니 숨 되바 용그리에서 지단에 도스들에 되바 용그리에서 지단 dine za lamsa ade chiwu chesan mi ba ade shi saresene me ba swe sha ba na ni be ya ko ma le so le dine za ngu dine za de chiwu chebe ne na ni men ni sum do shine sha ya ya dine do shine sha ya gi do shine sha ko le sa chi sum mo le chiwu che sar che lamsa da shi sar sha sen me ba su phung bo de me ba swe ne ya ko ma le se ke na wu che me ne ko ga shi swe sha ge swe ba da ji ba che ko le je za di lag me meta ta chen da shi sar sha meta ta sha be ne ko na wu che yo ma sen ba mo ne ga yo ma je za ne ma zu di swe ba da ji ba che ko le je de je za di ne za如果都是呢你们你送都是呢下午的这个去送过来
So this point here, at the time when the minds become subtle, virtuous, and when the mind becomes subtle, virtuous, non-virtuous minds cease and become unspecified. So at this point, a breath has ceased, but as I mentioned earlier, whilst this may be considered a death, and in general, whilst it may be considered in general in society that this is death, there is still breath within the body. And therefore, the mental consciousness, subtle mental consciousness, still abides within the body. And so, even for ordinary beings, they may well remain within the consciousness may well remain within the body for 2 or 3 days after breath has ceased. So therefore, whilst in general, this is the person is considered to be dead and ready to be buried, it would be ideal if one can leave the body relatively undisturbed, so not cremated, not buried just yet, because it is quite possible, and quite likely, that the consciousness, the subtle consciousness, is still abiding in the body.
인지 미제 내발이야 말다 인지 되네 망쳐래 대 용기서 타돼요 타돼 돼야 용기서 아니 수분 람산 dimaka야 돼 용기서 네 소모도 다 나로기 셈치면은 수분이 dimaka면서 루야게 루비기 dim마시어로와 루이르네지마
So this person who's now perhaps officially died, but because breathing has stopped, their subtle consciousness is still abiding within the body. And as mentioned earlier, a clear sign that final death has come and the body and the consciousness has moved on is when a little bit of blood is emitted from the nose. Here it should be said that it's not definite that in every instance this happens, but it is a very common sign. Another sign would be that the body is not yet smelling like rotting. There's a smell of, the body may smell, but it's not the smell of a rotting corpse. This hasn't started to happen yet because the consciousness still abides within the body. There is still life within the body. So we can potentially stop with looking at the text now and take questions if there are questions, otherwise I'll continue. So, are there questions?
Is the, in terms of the aggregates, is this end of life agony, is this at the dissolution of feelings or a discrimination? Surely.
At what point? Just be clear, at what point are we talking about now when just the subtle consciousness is in the body and the coarser ones are dissolved? Is it at that point or?
Where discrimination is dissolved, is that where the end of life agony would stop?
Okay.
Or is it feelings, or is it life?
Okay. So which of the dissolution of which aggregate indicates the actual end of life, the final ending? Yeah?
Or the agony, anyway. The end of life agony.
Oh, the end of life agony. That seemed to come before this, because there was still sense consciousness available, so that you could have the body sense consciousness, so you could still feel physical pain. So that was before breath stops.
Yeah.
So then the question?
So does the end of life agony still continue after breath stops? Or?
Okay.
Which is the other one? It's the composition factors.
디 풍봉하는데 당보 같이 요래라나 다리 풍보 라화치 외내네 곧 예디로 가다 마시 봐도 아니 그 셈디 네 마치 봐도 풍보도 예요 봐 풍보 예로 수기 풍보도 예로 와다 아니 수기 풍보도 요래 아니 모두 교육을 센다 수보 예요 와다 요래다 지난 시에바 요반장 시비 콜 초와 두시 선배 일에 저를 찾아 열어 봐. 지난 소위 공부 열에 이 넘버 10을 참아 요도 넘버 10을 콜이야 초와는 연구로 봐. 초와 두시 선배 일에 저를 봐서 넘버 10을 예지라 군동아도 요요 바로 봐. 넘버 10을 참아 넘버 10을 이나 콜 군동아 요거다. 제가 넘버 10을 참어 있나라 라과 있나라 그 넘버 10 인치제로 콜 군동아 요거다. 요거. 군동아 균이 매되게 넘버 10 콜 군동아 매되게 넘버 10을 저 여러 배스는 요 말이야. 나 바르도 저도 세디기 풍봉아지 제주어래. 마도 원보 풍보 세디기 풍봉아지 제주어래. 마도 원래 바르도께는 풍봉아 여여 바로. 풍봉아 균에 매바 차 매바다. 마다 님들 세디기 풍봉아 당원도 지교를 했어요.
So hopefully this will match the intent behind the question. So of the 5 aggregates, whilst we have consciousness of any subtlety, all 5 aggregates are present. All 5 aggregates are present. Because whilst there is consciousness, there are the 5 omnipresent mental factors, which include then 2 of the aggregates, differentiation or discrimination and feeling. So whilst there is consciousness of any level, of any coarseness or subtlety, one has the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates of this life cease together at the moment of death. And then new aggregates are taken. So the 5 aggregates do not cease sequentially, but simultaneously at the moment of death.
But in meditation, we are dissolving each aggregate at each level. Sequentially. So I don't understand how that works.
So you're talking about then the tantric presentation of the 8 stages of dissolution at death, right? Yeah.
예. 나리 내가 이거 쉐베나 아미 팀림림바로 쉐어로 숙다스. 팀림 쉐어 데 쉐어 팀비림바데 팀그레세데 쉐어레.
So yes, in the tantric presentation, there are stages of dissolution. In the tantric presentation.
예, 팀림세 세세데 디소 매와 차야 계시 말에. 그래서 난그 뉴벌 마소나 그 뉴벌 체중을 계시고 팀세 뉴벌 체중을 계시고래. 직 뉴벌 냠지 직 뉴벌 마 냠르 부르바지네 뉴비게 냠미야 림바지어 빼는 아주 두시네 하고도 앞에는 아주 두시네 마신이래야 수보도 되어서는 내나 수보 겨저 되는 마 수보디에 감감저 되네 두시네 감보라 차네 두신 되는 수비게 뉴슈메바 차지 온거로 받아 두시네 림바 용거래 내가 아주 디나셔야데 두시네 지다 두시레마도 직 10초 순거마다 아 거시도 거야 10초를 시기로다 팀림 뉴버디 직 뉴버 직 뉴버 줘야지 뉴버 팀림세 팀세 뉴버디 강가 뉴버디 마 중화시 뉴버디 봐 줘주고 뉴버디 봐 슈춘슈루고래 세유 중화디 뉴버 충줘 딘취 중화 뉴버 충어디 니 송고래 제자당은 세유 중화 충줘시데 수볼 따이도 수보 깜보차 대지도 수보 때서야 당도와 내가 차도 수마 깜깜깜깜 천데네 라과 짜마수 이게 세유 중화 마 뉴버 마 줘주고래 세유 중화 여러 와디네 여러데.
When one is engaging in the meditation on the dissolution of the elements, the sequential dissolution of the elements, what is being dissolved is their strength or potency. It's this that subsides. It's not that they become non-existent. So as one is going through the sequence of maybe I'll get it wrong, there's a translator, but it's okay. From water into fire, into earth, into wind energy. As one is going through the one dissolving into the next, it's not that the preceding one is now non-existent. It's rather its potency or its strength, potency or potential strength has subsided. So this we can then liken to when one is sick. One's physical strength lessens and one may get quite weak, but it's not that your earth element or your capacity of your earth element is lost or your strength is lost. It's just rather that it's subsided. So just like when you get very weak, progressively weak as you are sick. So this is similar with the meditation on the stages of dissolution.
So, just to clarify that, would that mean that the pain of dying, the agony, would continue until the breath stops?
So would the what's it called, end of life agony continue until breath stops?
용으로 하되네. 네, 그 수분 나중에 와야 돼. 우마가 봐도 용으로 와도 söylene. Dini 류기네 지도 야야 말와. 거기서는 그 소화수 류기 소화냠사로.
In brief, yes. So when the exhalation of the breath ceases, then one will not experience physical suffering. So the end-of-life agony of whatever severity it is will continue until breath stops. Okay. Yep.
If the physical body is cremated or buried or even frozen, before the subtle consciousness leaves it, what effect does that have on the subtle consciousness?
If the body is buried, cremated, or frozen whilst the subtle consciousness is still within the body, what effect does that have on the subtle consciousness? So of these three ways of disposing of the body, whilst it's still abiding, consciousness is still abiding within it. Let's take that of cremation first. So what's happening in cremation, the body is entered into the crematorium, or into the cremation area. When it's engulfed in flames, the body is destroyed, and the consciousness will leave the body because its physical abode is destroyed, therefore it will have to leave. So then death will come. So death will be brought to the person by means of the cremation. It will have, let's leave it at that. Then, in terms of the other two, freezing the body or burying the body, that will have no impact on the subtle consciousness because the body has not been destroyed. The subtle consciousness will remain, and when its time is up, it will go. So that will have no impact. However, the body is disposed whilst the consciousness is within, including via cremation, it will have no negative impact on the person, so on the subtle consciousness within. it's because I was asking for clarity on this. Will the person get upset or angry or something like that? So have a negative impact on the rebirth? And Geshe said no. Why? Because their mind at that point, as we in one of the last sentences we looked at, is unspecified. It can no longer be virtuous or non-virtuous. So the person cannot, for example, get angry because their body is being buried or burnt. So with an unspecified mind, or due to having an unspecified mind, it's not that the being can get afflicted by, or afflictions can arise because of what is happening to us. And then I asked then, so what about organ donation? So medicine decides that you're dead, but you've agreed to donate your organs. So what happens then? You're in the operating theater, you're not breathing anymore, you're considered dead, but your consciousness still abides. So here, Geshe says, it'll probably be similar to cremation in the sense that your body is being destroyed, and so consciousness will leave. But again, like with cremation, this isn't having a negative impact on one's ongoing journey. It's just you're being brought to, your consciousness is leaving sooner than if one had been left alone on the hospital bed. Okay? Bring that one.
Leading up to that moment of death, if somebody is having really severe appearances of negative appearances of the body being consumed, is that the ripening of negative karma would occur at that time? So at the time of death, is it possible that some of that ripening would have happened enough for them to change their rebirth?
If a person is dying with a non-virtuous mind, the mind at death is non-virtuous, then they're having these unpleasant, frightening appearances. So do those frightening appearances come from the ripening of non-virtuous karma? And therefore, is it possible that this non-virtuous karma that is being experienced as one is approaching death is exhausted, and therefore they have a positive rebirth?
Yeah, positive rebirth. Okay. From outside watching it, it might appear negative, but actually from their side,
Okay.
negative.
Did now the next now I do Yama Tiba Sasha Begi Dipiti Boti, Zoya Hammer, Mongol, Tachini, when is in a young that now at some also that when you're a devotion in Europe, that devoted that now at some children, Madame Merwada, she near Madron, Takawaki, that also you had when you had it, the young man. That is the Nigi mother, just mother, your mother.
So, briefly, unfortunately not, because whilst the frightening and scary appearances are the ripening of past non-virtue, it's a minor ripening, so it is not going to be exhausted. So the way I understand it is if the strength is of the imprint is whatever it is, what ripens into the appearance doesn't take away much of the strength of that imprint, because it's a minor effect. So therefore, it's not going to be exhausted, and therefore, having a non-virtuous mind as death is approaching, their rebirth is going to be unfortunate in the lower realms here. Right, do you want to follow?
Lead on to, like, if we, because as a nurse in an aged care, we come across this quite a lot, and we do use medication to reduce the effect of that anxiety and negative experience, I suppose, how would that affect that process of going into death? Because it does calm the mind generally, so the mind is more peaceful.
So can the application of medication which dulls the mind, can that help prevent an unfortunate rebirth, help prevent a negative mind, a non-virtuous mind at the time of death?
Because it does make the mind more peaceful.
More peaceful, yeah.
also the never bring the pink or the person do not know more the sort of no more the called pender or the pink. Chicken matter some now drinking as a kind of Howard. Dingo chronology, some now dingo and I think it's super mother, the thought mother, tick mother, some now daddy, yeah, there's some daddy dingo or what. Birmengi did cultures Lugi saw Noy Meva the Session, but the same you saw Noy Meva the Marwa, Lusurgi Noy Meva Session, the Lusur Noy the Lugi Indian as a Tatini Dumata Noy Meva, Tirua. There's some now look at it in the Koranchi to Guadik, Birmen Necato Marwa. Birmen digi some look kiwi, some look you are the Migu, some you are the Luma, Dilem ping bade. Ping bade. That was Lugi saw Duma Noy, Traponoy, Lusurgi Manoy, Pingirwa.
So probably in answer to your question, in brief, would be no. Then the expansive answer is there would be some temporary benefits in that the person will relax and will suffer less. But what the pain medication that is given, this is going to make a difference to the coarser level of physical sensation. So the body will relax and it will have some impact on the mind, but not much. They may well still have various appearances and arising in relation to virtuous and non-virtuous minds. And the medication that is being given is not going to stop the mind going in a virtuous or non-virtuous direction, and therefore the various appearance following. What the medication will lead to is that the body is more relaxed, and the body may well not respond to what's going on within the mind. So therefore, it's not, what it will not do is be a technique by which one is more likely to get a better rebirth. If the non-virtue is dominant, the rebirth will be in the low realms. Okay. Cameron?
Just regarding the matter of cremation, where a person stops breathing but is not yet dead, if they're cremated at that time, is the cremation then a type of murder or manslaughter that would result in substantial negativity on the parts of people who are destroying the body?
So the person who, the cremators, are they creating non-virtue because there is still life in the body?
Yeah.
예. 단 디버 첨부 사스는 아주 그신 디버 사야야. 아니 지거로래. 디버 첨부 사바이나 군로다, 조와다, 뭐시다. 아니 죽차단 상국으리에서 미세베게 편지게 레 디버 첨부 사야 구리에서 저와 저산 디차산 상금에서 조와 지거로 받아. 맞아. 단디 뭐시다. 군로 가면로 이제 디버를 충충지 용 디버 그래서 이 용거래 되면 디니 첨부라 말.
When we looked at karma last year, we saw that there are these 4 components that are required for a complete action. And a complete action means that it's of that karmic action or that karma will be of full strength and can lead to propelling karma. If the actions are incomplete, then the karma is much weaker. So those 4 elements, the one is an object. So in this case, there is the person, and or the person in their body, and then the second is motivation. The motivation to kill, that's absent. There's a motivation to burn a corpse, which is how it's perceived. That is there, but not a motivation to kill. Then there is the performance, or the actual doing of the deed, and the completion in that the person is killed. So of those 4, we see there that the motivation motivation to kill is absent. So therefore, yes, some non-virtue is accumulated, but it is not of much magnitude. So we can conclude there then for this morning. More questions may well come, and then we can continue this afternoon. Thank you.